A vice president steps to a microphone and declares the ending before the story is even told. An ICE agent fires a fatal shot in Minneapolis, and the verdict, we are told, is already written. Absolute immunity. Case closed. That kind of certainty is seductive. It sounds like order. It sounds like authority. It sounds like the law working exactly as designed. But law is rarely absolute, and power almost never is. Behind that single sentence lies a far more fragile system, one built on conditions, judgments, and facts that are still disputed. What matters here is not just who pulled the trigger, but who gets to decide what accountability even looks like. If you care about how justice actually functions in moments of state power, not just how it is defended on television, you should keep watching. Because this story is not about immunity itself. It is about how immunity is claimed, tested, and sometimes quietly reshaped. To understand why this case refuses to be simple, we have to begin with the question everyone thinks they already know the answer to. The question sounds straightforward. Do federal agents have absolute immunity when they act on the job? The vice president's answer was simple and final. A federal officer enforcing federal law is shielded from state prosecution. End of discussion. But the legal system does not run on declarations. It runs on tests, it runs on standards, and it runs on judges who are required to ask uncomfortable questions. Legal experts push back immediately because American law has never treated federal power as untouchable. For more than a century, courts have recognized that federal officials can be criminally charged by states for actions taken during their duties. Immunity is not automatic. It is conditional. The real issue is not whether a case can be brought. It is whether it can survive, and that distinction changes everything. Once charges are filed, the battlefield shifts away from politics and into procedure. Jurisdiction matters. Evidence matters. And intent, context, and judgment suddenly become decisive. To see how this actually plays out, we have to step back and look at the legal framework that quietly governs these confrontations. To understand this conflict, we need historical context. Federal authority did not emerge as an untouchable shield. It evolved through repeated clashes between states and Washington. Courts were forced to referee power, not celebrate it. The Constitution anticipated conflict between federal and state sovereignty. That tension produced what lawyers call Supremacy Clause immunity. It was never meant to erase accountability entirely. Instead, it was designed to prevent state sabotage. States could not criminalize legitimate federal enforcement wholesale. But legitimacy was always the key variable. Courts insisted actions remain tied to lawful duties. They also demanded conduct stay within reasonable bounds. This framework hardened over decades of judicial decisions. Each case added nuance, not certainty. Immunity became a process, not a promise. Judges became gatekeepers rather than rubber stamps. Facts on the ground began to matter profoundly. Context, timing, and perception shaped every ruling. Power survived scrutiny only when restraint could be shown. That history explains why modern cases resist shortcuts. It also explains why absolute immunity sounds appealing. Simple rules comfort institutions under public pressure. Complexity, by contrast, invites doubt and scrutiny. That doubt is exactly where accountability begins. From here, theory collides with reality. The first crisis erupted in Minneapolis. Renee Nicole Good, 37, was seated in her car. An ICE agent fired. She was killed instantly. The vice president claimed the officer was untouchable. Federal immunity, he insisted, made any prosecution impossible. But experts saw a far more complicated scene. This was not a legal guarantee. It was a political statement. Videos reviewed by CNN suggest nuance. Good's actions on the scene were unclear. DHS described her as a rioter, attempting to use her vehicle against officers. Local footage showed something less straightforward. The tension between narrative and evidence sparked outrage. Minnesota officials were blocked from the investigation. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension could not access all evidence. The FBI was called in to gather files for state and federal prosecutors. Without full access, accountability could be deferred or denied. The moment highlights a deeper truth. Authority and procedure collide. The public witnesses a fatal event, but justice is processed quietly and bureaucratically. It is here, in this liminal space, that the system's hidden mechanisms begin to show. The legal mechanism behind claims of immunity is not a shield but a filter. Federal officers can face state charges, but the path is complex. First, a case may be moved to federal court. There, the judge asks, was the officer acting in the scope of official duties? This is usually easy to establish. The second step is far more nuanced. It hinges on reasonableness under the circumstances. Every action is measured against what a reasonable officer would do on that scene at that exact moment. Witness testimony, video footage, and context all become crucial. Experts stress that reasonableness is the linchpin of accountability. It is evaluated continuously from the moment of the act to the final court decision. The federal judge must balance authority with individual rights. Supremacy clause immunity does not grant carte blanche. It operates as a conditional check, not a guarantee. Its subtlety is what makes prosecution difficult but not impossible. This hidden mechanism explains why political assertions of absolute immunity often collide with legal reality. The system's complexity, its reliance on evidence and judgment, ensures that every high-profile case becomes a test of both law and fact. Tension escalated again as the second crisis unfolded. Federal and state investigators clashed over access to evidence. Minnesota officials were blocked from participating in the probe. The BCA superintendent warned that without full evidence, investigative standards could not be met. Protests erupted nationwide. Communities questioned the fairness of a system that shields federal officers. Critics argued that the narrative of immunity ignored the human cost. DHS insisted Good had been a rioter, framing the shooting as enforcement necessity. Videos told a more complicated story. Footage suggested the incident was not as clear-cut as official statements implied. The public's trust was shaken. The line between lawful enforcement and unchecked power blurred. This crisis exposed the fragile interface between authority and accountability. It revealed how political declarations, procedural barriers, and incomplete investigations can escalate tensions. In that escalation, the human dimension, fear, outrage, grief, intensifies. The system was tested again, not by law alone, but by perception, evidence, and public scrutiny. And in this test, the stakes were nothing less than faith in justice itself. For the people watching, the stakes are deeply personal. You see headlines and statements on television. You see a vice president declaring immunity as if it were fact. And yet, the reality on the street is far less clear. Families wonder if the law protects them or only those in power. Communities grieve while questioning whether justice will ever reach them. The fear is palpable. One misstep, one moment of misjudgment, and lives are lost. You feel the tension because it touches something universal. The sense that rules are written for others, that accountability is conditional, fragile, sometimes inaccessible. Experts explain the mechanics of immunity, of federal versus state jurisdiction, but mechanics alone cannot address the emotional toll. The human impact is immediate, raw, and undeniable. If you have ever doubted whether a system exists to protect the vulnerable, this moment reminds you why scrutiny, transparency, and civic awareness matter. Because understanding the law is not enough. We must feel its consequences to act. And as the nation watches, the question lingers: who decides what is reasonable when life hangs in the balance? The reverberations of this incident reach far beyond Minnesota. Federal authority, accountability, and public trust are under international scrutiny. Allies and observers watch how the U.S. balances law enforcement with civil liberties. When images of protests circulate globally, the American system becomes a case study. How can a country claim moral authority if its own citizens question whether justice applies equally? Nations with tense federal-state dynamics take note, and adversaries exploit perceived inconsistencies to weaken diplomatic standing. The debate over immunity, enforcement, and accountability sends signals to foreign governments. It shapes negotiations, alliances, and perceptions of reliability. A single high-profile shooting can influence not just domestic policy, but also global credibility. Legal procedures, political statements, and media narratives intertwine. The world observes both the law and its execution. Every blocked investigation, every disputed claim of immunity adds to the story that reaches beyond borders. America's internal struggle over authority and accountability is thus also a geopolitical signal. It demonstrates the tension between the ideals a nation promotes and the realities it enforces. The eyes of the world are watching, and the stakes could not be higher. Looking ahead, 3 possible futures emerge from this crisis. In the best-case scenario, the law works as intended. Investigations proceed with transparency. Federal and state authorities collaborate. Evidence is fully reviewed, and accountability is established without political interference. Trust is restored, and the public sees that even powerful actors are not beyond scrutiny. In a middling scenario, the system falters but does not collapse. Some evidence remains inaccessible. Prosecutions face procedural hurdles, and decisions are slow. Public confidence erodes, and cynicism grows. The law functions, but unevenly, leaving lingering doubts and unresolved grievances. In the worst-case scenario, immunity claims dominate. Investigations are stymied. Political declarations override judicial scrutiny. The public perceives a system that protects power at the expense of ordinary citizens. Protests intensify, polarization deepens, and the credibility of institutions suffers lasting damage. The path chosen will depend on facts, judgment, and the courage to enforce accountability. It is a test not only of law but of national character. Every decision, every obstruction, every revelation shapes the story of America's commitment to justice. From here, the nation must consider whether it values principle over expedience, whether systems are designed to serve people or protect authority, and whether future generations will inherit a framework that is just, fair, and credible. This moment leaves us with a stark insight. Power is never absolute, and neither is accountability. Declarations of immunity may comfort officials, but they do little to resolve the deeper questions of justice. The system is not a monolith. It is a living mechanism, dependent on evidence, judgment, and public vigilance. What happens next will define more than one case. It will define trust in institutions, in law enforcement, and in the promise that every individual is protected under the law. If the law bends too easily to political pressure, the balance of power tilts, and ordinary citizens feel the weight first. The shooting of Renee Nicole Good is more than a tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting how fragile justice can be when authority and oversight collide. And it is a call to action, to observe, to question, and to insist that transparency and accountability are non-negotiable. Stay engaged, because the choices made now will echo far into the future. The eyes of the public, the press, and the courts are all watching. Justice is not granted, it is enacted, defended, and demanded. This is the story of law, of power, and of the people who must hold both to account. And in that story, the next chapter is still being written.